Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome. I'm delighted to be here and to see you in person. This is your first event back in person. It's also my first event. It's been, the last time I gave a talk was in March 2020. So it's just nice to see real people and to be able to look at you face to face. I'm looking forward to our question and answer session where we can actually have even more of a conversation. Imagine that. So that's great. But I'd like to thank the University of Maryland for having me here today. I'm delighted to be here at the center. A special shout out. It's great to see Dean Robert Orr, who I've known for many years and I've respected so much for your leadership in multilateral affairs and in education as well. So I particularly am delighted to be re-entering the public space at your institution. And I'm delighted to be here for the warm welcome for Conservative University of Maryland. So today I will talk about gaining and retaining international leadership by creating conditions in which others want to be part of your sphere, whether economically, politically, socially, or technologically. Now, that power of attraction includes international education and wanting to attend a country's institutions of higher education. Now, I'm delighted to be speaking today. It's great to be able to talk about the intersection of international affairs and international education. Indeed, those have been different elements of my career, as you've noted, and I've had the opportunity to work both at the State Department, but also have taught courses on U.S. foreign policy and international organizations, on established and emerging powers and international affairs. And I love that interplay between what you learn in the classroom and what you do in your work as well. And so this talk draws on my experiences both in the classroom and in various offices I've held. As you know now, I have the honor to serve as Executive Director and CEO of NAFSA, the Association of International Educators. And during my talk, I'll tell you what that acronym actually stands for. NAFSA is the largest and most comprehensive association dedicated to achieving international higher education goals. We have around 10,000 members around the world. We are based in the United States, headquartered here in Washington, D.C. We have members throughout the United States at over 3,500 institutions. We were founded in 1948. No accident there. What happened in 1946? The creation of the Fulbright-Hays Act. Within 2 years, there were already 25,000 international students in the United States. And administrators at many universities that were hosting international students realized they would benefit from exchanging best practices and created NAFSA. We provide professional development programs, products, and services that support professionals in international education. Prompted by its periodic review of our strategic plan, in 2020, NAFSA's board crystallized its strategic plan into 3 themes: educate, advocate, and innovate, and to do so by connecting people. Many of our members are on campuses, including this one. We hope to encourage cooperation among people interested in building connections. Yes, we educate. We provide professional development training to administrators running programs. We publish a range of books, reports, and monographs, as well as International Educator magazine. We advocate. We have a very active public policy department, and we are ardent advocates of the field of international education. We work with policymakers and staffs in executive branch departments, as well as in Capitol Hill. We have an expert team in our regulatory practice office. Their insights help members across the country understand complex federal regulations around visas and whether it's optional practical training and other related topics. And I'll tell you, our public policy team is keeping an eye on whether they're able to, what happens on the budget issue, because again, the immigration issues, obviously we're interested in particularly of these issues are there. So I tell you, our public policy team is busy and in the office today. We innovate. Like many, the onslaught of the COVID-19 pandemic required significant changes. So just like professors here, we have now converted our entire professional development program to online programs. And the programs used to be set up such that we'd actually go to your campus around the country and train professionals. And so it was a big shift to go from that type of in-person to online. But just like so many others, we had to do that as well. So that's just a little background on who NAFSA is. Now let's look at the nature of international leadership, and then we'll look at the intersection of that and international education. Now, of course, there are many forms of international leadership, and we'll be talking about military leadership, political, economic, diplomatic, soft power and smart power, social and cultural leadership. If I were focusing my lecture solely on political leadership, I might be talking about the ability to set the international agenda. I might talk about what are the responsibilities of leaders to sustain the system as well as advance their own interests. If we were talking about economic leadership, we might be talking about setting the rules for economic interaction or setting the standards for certain products. If we were talking about social and cultural leadership, we might be talking about setting the norms of behavior. And indeed, education can be considered a long-term investment in political, diplomatic, soft power, and smart power. I would suggest that international education is as part of public diplomacy. Public diplomacy involves reaching out to societies, not just a country's officials. Hosting students from other countries is a great way to introduce them to your country, its history, its culture, and to foster lifelong affinities with your country. And indeed, multiple entities have recognized this. As I just mentioned, the United States has supported the Fulbright program, just one of many, for over 70 years. The European Union created the Erasmus program to foster a generation of young people who would feel European. And indeed, the Erasmus Plus program connects students from around the world to the European Union. Hence, that's how US students can participate in the program. And I did note that just in the past year, that having departed the European Union, the United Kingdom is looking to recreate education connections by creating something called the Turing program, named after Alan Turing. So many governments, as I was trying to share with you, around the world recognize the importance of international education and incorporate it into their foreign policy. I'd say in particular that as a subset of public diplomacy, knowledge diplomacy is a type of public diplomacy that uses collaborative research to foster international connections. Enhancing exchanges in science and research can widen the number of people involved in exchanges and deepen the quality of research. Indeed, international collaboration has been a feature of scientific research for centuries. We, of course, are living through yet another example of that because all of the vaccines from which we have been so thankful to benefit have been developed by teams of international researchers. Now, scholars are actually on the front lines, and then you may talk about this question and answer, that indeed the importance of and the role of international research cooperation has also become a highly sensitive issue. And as you know, among the many challenges in the US-China relationship has been the debate we've seen here about the approach towards scholars engaged in joint research projects. The sense have ended up on the front lines of national security debates. At NAFSA, we see international education as a long-term investment in improving human well-being. And it's interesting, when you think about your career and where you work, I would say that NAFSA falls in the category of a mission-driven organization. So when you go to our strategic plan, when it talks about the role of international education in the world at large, it actually starts off with a preamble. The What We Believe section says, quote, "We believe that international education lies at the core of an interconnected world characterized by diversity, equity, inclusion, social justice, and well-being for all. NAFSA believes that diversity in our classrooms, our communities, and our workplaces is our strength." In the vision section of that preamble, the document states, "NAFSA aspires to an environment in which every student, scholar, and practitioner seeking the benefits of international education finds a path. And every institution of higher education integrates international perspectives into its teaching, research, and service missions. We aspire to enlightened international relations, globally engaged citizenry, and a more peaceful and just world," end quote. Now, if we were talking about, I say, any of the variety of different types of international leadership, we might be talking about political or military leadership, which could mean, for example, command of global spaces, the seas, airspace, outer space, cyberspace. But interestingly, the knowledge space is not finite. Indeed, cooperation can open new fields of research and learning. Yet, as I will share with you in a moment, there's also a certain global competition and rivalry amongst countries a friendly rivalry just for seeking out the best talent. Now, having set the table of international leadership, let's now lay out the meal. What does international education include? Now, the most famous part of international education is mobility. Sending students abroad, welcoming international students. Now, the expansion is actually visible in NAFSA's own history. Now, at the beginning, I said I'd let you know what the acronym actually stands for, which is always a good trivia point. The acronym actually stands for the National Association of Foreign Student Advisors. Because as I mentioned, the first group were people who were receiving international students, and they were foreign student advisors. And so that NAFSA started in terms of welcoming international students and sharing expertise about that. Then, decades later, we expanded to working on education abroad and now to internationalization of the curriculum. And internationalization of the curriculum or internationalization at home. And that is an even larger concept than direct mobility. It's also been extremely important, as you can imagine, as we've moved to the virtual world, the ability to continue international education through joint programs online has been extremely important. And some of the most interesting innovation we've seen is how international educators have used the principles of internationalization to be able to continue their cooperation in their programs through the pandemic period. Now, internationalization is a way to bring global learning into the classroom. It may, but does not necessarily mean physical mobility or exchange. Internationalization at home can inspire curricular innovation and reshaping the curriculum or recasting of international norms within an institution. From the growth of strategic global partnerships to international joint degrees, to team teaching among professors and classrooms in different countries, we are seeing the spread of innovative arrangements. These developments benefit students, faculty, administrators, and their institutions. These developments can also help deepen the global network of people who understand and respect each other, irrespective of nationality. Such connections can be even more important as we strive to maintain international connections despite the pandemic. Each year, NAFSA heralds excellence in internationalization in the United States through NAFSA's annual Senator Paul Simon Award for Campus Internationalization. The Senator Paul Simon Award for Campus Internationalization recognizes U.S. colleges and universities that are making significant, well-planned, well-executed, and well-documented progress toward comprehensive internationalization, especially those using innovative and creative approaches, which is another reason why I'm so happy to be here, because as you may know, in 2020, University of Maryland, College Park won a Simon Award for your Year of Immigration Initiative. So it's particularly special to be here at a Simon Award winning institution. Now, interestingly enough, we're saying that not only are international educators talking about innovation and their role in creating connections internationally, we see international policymakers as well, recognizing the importance of higher education and global affairs. So one area I would mention is that for those of you who follow international development issues, one of the Sustainable Development Goals, Goal 4, as you know, is to ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. One of the interesting differences between the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals is the addition of higher education. That understandably, traditional development theory has focused on basic education and primary education, but higher education, tertiary education, appears in the SDGs. So if you go to the sub-goals, if you go to target 4.3, quote, by 2030, ensure equal access for all women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education, including university. If you go to target 4B, quote, by 2020, now this was obviously written before the pandemic, substantially expand globally the number of scholarships available to developing countries, in particular, least developed countries, small island developing states, and African countries, for enrollment in higher education, including vocational training and information and communications technology, technical, engineering, and scientific programs in developed countries and other developing countries. So as I said, higher education appears explicitly in the Sustainable Development Goals. And we are seeing increasingly trying to link efforts about the conversation about international development and international education. So, Dinor, you won't be surprised to know that I started at NAFSA in 2017, and for our annual conference, I invited Helen Clark. She had just to be our speaker at our Pathways for Peace luncheon. She had just finished her leadership of the UN Development Program. So I said, "You're out of office now. You will be out of office by a full week by the time we have our conference. You can speak your mind. Would you come and speak to the NAFSA conference," which she did. And in my message to the conference participants, because we were sent on notes saying, encourage people to come to the event, I noted, quote, that though the United Nations Sustainable Goals are not always seen as a leading issue in the United States, in other countries, including major ascending countries, the role of education in sustainable development shapes national policies. In those countries, the concept of sustainable development informs economic and social policies, which can expand the middle class and increase demands for higher education. By better understanding these trends, we are stronger partners within global higher education. And I'm still thinking about how we can talk about the SDGs at next year's annual conference. So Shannon, we'll keep talking about how we can make sure we're keeping the global perspective in our conference, even though we're based here in the United States. Yet, we also have to acknowledge that while we talk about progress in international education, the impact of the pandemic. So if you go to the SDGs page now, you'll see that UNDESA, the Department for Economic and Social Affairs, reports, quote, COVID-19 has wiped out 20 years of education gains. We have work to do. Now, one of the other drivers of international education and why so many countries are interested in international education leadership is the importance of knowledge-based economies, the need for talent and innovation. And so the efforts to work on global workforce development is another impetus behind international education, while we see quite a lot of interest from the global business community in international education. Some of our publications at NAFSA touch on this issue. So we did a report, partnered with an organization called EMSI. In 2019, we partnered to do with MC, which is a US-based economic modeling firm, and we analyzed hundreds of millions of US job postings and professional profiles to determine the connection between study abroad and employer-desired skills. The report, Developing a Globally Competitive Workforce Through Study Abroad, the Value of Study Abroad Skills in the US Job Market, came out in 2019. We found at that point in that report that more than 31 million job openings required skills that a student acquires while studying abroad. Employers found they spent more time seeking qualified applicants for these positions versus the average job opening. They were looking for these skills. Employers and job seekers recognize that skills developed during study abroad are essential for management and leadership positions. Professional profiles that highlight the key study abroad soft skills include a higher number of people in positions such as presidents and CEOs than those without those skills. Competition for talent is essential. Of course, not surprisingly, universities are at the crux of these developments. They're also at the crux of these developments because so many of the issues that we are grappling with today have a transnational character, require international cooperation, and cooperation based on international cooperation and expertise to solve. So whether we're looking at climate change, public health, or looking for models of social justice, higher education institutions are at the forefront of addressing these problems, and their international connections are directly relevant to addressing these problems. And indeed, higher education institutions are being asked to address social inequality, to help transitions to the new economy of knowledge-based jobs, and global learning. The importance of global learning includes understanding the world beyond one's borders, being an essential aspect for leadership. Global learning expands access and contributes to the development of the globally prepared citizen, which is crucial for the healthy functioning of liberal democracy. And I would suggest that tapping into the power of attraction also resonates within US foreign policy. Because I would suggest that part of the US's own view of itself also is based on the power of attraction. So the classic example of this, often cited, of course, is the 1630 City on a Hill speech. The sermon by Puritan John Winthrop, who proclaimed while sailing on the ship Arabella in Massachusetts, quote, "We shall be as a city upon a hill." Now, this was later adopted in many forms, but most particularly as into a political platform in the 1980s. But you actually see this even in some of our debates, for example, on the nature of how you promote human rights. Do you focus on working on standards internationally, or do you try to create a more perfect society at home as an example? You can think of the modern echoes of this debate. And then what happens when the domestic conditions deteriorate if your model is trying to be based on what you're doing at home? There are other aspects. So there's the whole power of attraction idea and the being the exemplar element in U.S. foreign policy. Another is the immigration issues, and I'm happy to go into greater detail on this, but to say that the debates about the nature of immigration in the United States have also reflected and influenced international education and international leadership. So what are the current issues? I mean, current issue now is what should be the immigration status towards the international student. So this goes under the jargon term of dual intent now. And for those of you who are international students, you'll know that when you're applying for your visa, you have to basically say, you will go home. Whereas other countries are busy saying, please come stay. You've earned your degree. We want you to stay. One of the things you won't be surprised to know that NAFSA is very much an advocate for dual intent, to say that students ought to be able to say, we want to come to the United States, we want to learn, and we'd like to stay, and be able to be able to say you have the intent of either staying or returning home. The other issue is, quote, stapling the green card to graduation. In other words, should immigration rules make accommodations for people who've studied here in the United States? Many countries are making much greater efforts to keep their international students. And so that is, I say, a live issue, something we're directly advocating on, keeping our eyes open for legislation. You can imagine the complications, but that is, I say, an important issue, so that in terms of U.S. foreign policy issues, that the immigration debate also plays into international education and leadership in international education. Now, other aspects that international education, you think of international leadership, has also been an integral part of rebuilding the world. If we look at a variety of different ways in which the United States has reached out to try to rebuild communities, education has been part of that. I flagged the Fulbright-Hays Act as part of the post-World War II environment. Of course, we have extremely poignant examples now of the efforts to help scholars in Afghanistan. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. We've also seen that prominent policymakers recognize the importance of international education as part of U.S. leadership. So you probably saw two recent articles. One, Samantha Power, now head of USAID, and former U.S. ambassador to the United Nations in New York. In her January-February article in the January-February issue of Foreign Affairs, the article's entitled "The Can-Do Power, America's Advantage and Biden's Chance," she wrote, quote, "One of the best ways to showcase the United States' ingenuity and know-how is to again make its universities the most attractive in the world to foreign talent," end quote. And you imagine we were thrilled with her comment that also in that article, quote, "It is hard to think of a more cost-effective way for Biden to reach global populations concerned about the direction of the United States than by celebrating the fact that the country is once again welcoming bright young minds from around the world," end quote. And Michael Mafal, former U.S. ambassador to Russia and a long-time foreign policy scholar, in an article that just came out this week called "Sometimes You Get Another Chance." It's an article in the American Purpose, and it's based off of his forthcoming book. He also noted, quote, "Greater resources should be devoted to educational programs that provide information about democracy, the rule of law, and liberalism more generally, as well as the exchange programs that bring students and visitors from autocratic countries to the United States," end quote. I'll also suggest that there are real world benefits. They're talking about these part of the foreign policy benefits. I think there's some very practical benefits. And Dinora, you may want to share some of your experiences, but I'll just think of two that where I found that having studied abroad myself and being aware of alternative understandings of words came into real play. One was, and this is all before you were born, so was being part of the delegation in 2000 that was working on a resolution on the right to democracy at what was then the Human Rights Commission in Geneva. And in 1999 was the first time that a UN body in Geneva had recognized a right to democracy. 2000, we were working on expanding that from basically like 2-line resolution to building that out. And so one of the things we were debating was the word accountability and how both translated into French, but then also what did it mean and what were the implications behind that? And so those fascinating conversations was thinking about drawing on what I'd been studying, not just a few years before, trying to have the intellectual conversation, the variety of people on the nature of what that word meant, and being able to draw on our experience of having been studied outside the US, and my interlocutors who haven't studied in the US, and being able to draw on some of the things we'd heard in each other's classrooms. The other one was the understanding of the nature of the source of rights, whether individual and group. And so there was a subset of my career that had to do with the letter S, which is people and peoples. Do rights, and particularly when you're talking about the rights of indigenous people, individuals, or peoples, groups. And so being able to then be aware of different intellectual trends and different discussions when you were talking about what that meant was important. And as you can imagine, you could have knocked me over with a feather when I did actually get a request from our colleagues down the hall of the State Department for my dissertation. Whenever reads your dissertation, your mom reads your dissertation, your committee reads your dissertation. I was like, oh, you want my dissertation? Because it had a discussion of individual and group rights. But that was, again, it was because I'd been looking at different intellectual trends in different countries on these ideas. So now, if we look at currently this idea of international leadership and international education, this has been an exciting spring. So for the first time in 20 years, we've had an administration issue a strong statement in support of international education. NAFSA has been working with key higher education institutions, including the Association of Public Land-Grant Universities and the Institute for International Education, among others, to urge the administration and Congress to adopt an international recruitment strategy in order to increase the number and diversity of international students and scholars who travel to the United States to study or conduct research. NAFSA and our colleagues, we've been at this for years. So this spring, it's really summer, when we had a statement from the Department of State and Department of Education, and Secretary Blinken actually recorded and issued in June, was a joint statement of principles. This is a welcoming initiative. It is fabulous to see. Department of Commerce and Department of Homeland Security have associated themselves with. So to see the major departments and the administration come out in support of a national strategy has been fantastic. As I say, NAFSA has advocated for a national strategy on international education for years, including in the extensive transition documents we shared with people as they were getting ready for their confirmation hearings, that we have advocated for strategy for international education for years, and we look forward to continue to work with the Biden-Harris administration to see these principles put into action. Now, to ensure a welcoming environment for international students and scholars and researchers, we think there needs to be a whole of government strategy. So I'll let you know that what NAFSA is advocating on for now, that we think that this effort should now be led by a White House coordination mechanism with the Departments of State, Commerce, Education, Homeland Security. We think that a national strategy would shift the United States into a proactive posture, demonstrating that a country is serious about attracting a diverse pool of talented individuals to study or conduct research at our institutions of higher education. We've long argued that international students create jobs, drive research, enrich our classrooms, strengthen our national security, and become America's greatest foreign policy assets. Now, we think that, again, not surprising, international education we think is good for the United States and the world as a whole. We also think attracting international students and scholars is an important way that the United States grows its knowledge economy. In an era of competition for scarce global talent, the countries that draw the world's best and brightest to their universities are the countries which will have the best talent pool from which to fill cutting-edge jobs. Countries that create the most attractive environment for the world's finest scientists will do the most to enhance their scientific leadership. And indeed, the very diversity that we gain through openness to talent is itself an important aspect. And indeed, recovery is needed. So the The United States is still recovering from the challenges of dealing with 4 years of administration that disparaged such international connections, issued the travel bans and other issues. And of course, the impact of COVID-19 has been particularly acute as well. Now, we know that we also regularly measure the impact of international education and the contribution of international education. So the Department of Commerce also, of course, measures this. They argue that the Department of Commerce, of course, measures the export value of international students because, again, education is an export. So before COVID, that higher education had risen to become the 5th largest service export of the United States, on par with pharmaceuticals. So when people talk about this, they have to remember the impact for the economy. And indeed, one of the effects of the pandemic was, according to the Department of Commerce, that in their report in July 2021, that higher education had fallen by $9.5 billion, or about 20%. So I would say that, of course, NAFSA, as you heard, first and foremost values international education for its academic and cultural links and the importance and its human value. But we also know that it's important to be able to measure its economic value. So one of the things we are known for is our International Student Economic Value tool. And I will read this because this is going to be very small. But one of the things we measure is the economic contribution of international education to the United States. And we're able to do it nationally and by state and by congressional districts. So we spend quality time with members of Congress being able to tell them how many jobs in their district are directly linked to international education. So we did note that in the 2019-2020 period, that international students and their families contributed $38.7 billion annually and supported 416,000 jobs during that period. That's 3 jobs created and supported for every international student enrolled in colleges and universities. So this is a bipartisan issue. And that's rare these days because people on both sides of the aisle recognize that they benefit from having talented individuals in their districts. And just to share with you, Jesse, you don't have to worry about this is just a timeline chart from the fall of 2007 to 2017, just to show you that the number of international students in the United States has increased, the blue line. Their economic contribution has increased as well, which is the green sway there, to show you that there's actually been, over the past generation, in the 21st century, there's been an increase in the number of students here and their contribution. We will be doing our calculations quite soon, and we will be issuing in November our latest figures on the contribution of international students. I thought you might want to also see that if you go to our website, you can go and there's a whole international, it's in front of the paywall, so you can go and have a look at it. So you can look up the state of Maryland, and you can look up the number of jobs supported by different institutions in the state of Maryland. We actually then broke out the University of Maryland into different quadrants. And so you can actually even go in, and if you want to look up your congressional district, you can do that as well. Let me go back a couple. And then we find that our media colleagues particularly like to do that. Now, one of the things that's also interesting was the importance of international students, of course, has been recognized by many countries around the world as well. So the other interesting change has been the growth of international education worldwide. And as I mentioned earlier, the growth of rivalry amongst host countries. So in 2001, according to Project Atlas, there was in 2001, there were only about 2.1 million international students worldwide. By 2010, there were 4.1 million students studying outside their native country. And in 2020, there were over 5.6 million higher education students who studied abroad. So one of these important areas has been the expansion of international students. The other important thing is that more countries are hosting international students and recognizing the benefit for their countries of having international students. So this chart, and again, I'll read you some of it, but the gist of it is to show that not only the United States has increased the number of international students and hosted over 1 million students for the past several years, that other countries have also experienced important growth of international students. So if we take, for example, our neighbors, Canada, if you look at the difference between 2014, hosted over 237,000 international students. By 2020, that had risen to 503,270. Canada, of course, has had an ambitious program to bring international students, has outstanding educational institutions, and has had a concerted effort to actually bring international students to Canada. And indeed, during the challenges of the Trump years, there was also a noticeable increase in 1 year, 16% of students going to Canada as opposed to the United States. But we also note that more countries are also becoming destinations for international education. I note China. China here we pick up here in 2014, but if you go back to some of IE and Project Atlas count back to 2000, you'll see that China does not appear in effect in 2000 and has now become a major host for international students, to the point that it is actually rivaling the United Kingdom, which has always been the second largest host of international students after the United States. So we're seeing that more countries are actually have concerted programs, and we work closely with all countries. Everyone comes to NAFSA, and one of the things we talk about is how you become an attractive space for international students. What's interesting to see that every country includes international education in their foreign ministries. It's no surprise that Educational and Cultural Affairs is a department in the Department of State, and every other country also has an aspect of their work in international affairs as part of their diplomacy. The Ministry of Education is maybe involved too, but there's usually always a diplomatic element as well. So we can talk a bit about this, but when we think about leadership and international affairs, one of the most important things is this dynamic as more countries are working to become hosts for international students. Now, we will see what happens now. As you imagine, during the pandemic era, there was a decline in international students. Many students who either had to go home or were not able to enter the United States and other countries. We, this year, have really been focusing on visa issuance, and I've spent quality time encouraging the State Department and the colleagues to accelerate their visa issuance. Indeed, there's been a remarkable number of visas issued in just over the past month. Just this week, Karen Fisher, who is the Chronicle of Higher Education reporter who covers international education, noted that, quote, overall student visa issuances for May, June, and July, typically the 3 business months, were 1% ahead of pre-pandemic levels. Welcome confirmation of a fall rebound in international students after the sharp COVID-related enrollment declines. And she noted that, quote, with the addition of July's numbers, India visa issuances since May are 37% higher than during the same period in 2019. And in China, which accounts for more than a third of international students in the US, the number of visas approved between May and July was about 2% ahead of 2019 rates. So going by this summer of visas, we're expecting to be able to see more international students here. So finally, I would say that international education community not only encourages the creation of a knowledge economy, creates the intellectual stimulus of working with colleagues from around the world. It also has always tried to reach out to help each other in crises. I'll say if you go through NAFSA, and we're actually commissioned a study of NAFSA's history, our 75th anniversary is next year. And that one of the things we see is that from very early on, NAFSA has been involved in trying to help students in crises. We found in 1948, 1949, one of the first things that NAFSA does is try to help the then 300 Chinese students who were stranded in the United States after the 1949 revolution. Whether it was the Iranian students or Afghan students now, the international community has international educators is very active. According to IIE's Open Doors reports, there were that a year ago there were about 1,000 Haitian students and a little over 400 Afghan students in the United States. I'll tell you, NAFSA has sent letters both to the Department of State and DHS urging that the agencies, quote, take immediate action to protect the lives of and provide stability to Afghan students, scholars, and researchers, and those involved in advocating for, promoting, or engaging in higher education. I will note also on our webpage, you'll see information resources for assisting Afghan students and scholars. And I want to give a shout out to the Institute for International Education, which has a very good Afghan crisis page as well. And their long-standing Scholars at Risk program has been working with international students. Finally, I'll say I've talked a lot about welcoming international students. Education abroad is also an important part of international education leadership, and we argue it's not a luxury, that actually the skills gained through international education are especially important, and NAFSA has been involved in those areas as well. And so some of the areas that are particularly important now that NAFSA, in terms of our new programs, include the NAFSA RISE program, which is a fellowship program which enables us particularly to reach out to minority administrators to try to increase the diversity amongst the international education community. A lot of work to be done there, as well as the efforts to, as I say, to convert all of our training programs to the virtual space. Finally, we're getting ready for next year. We're honored to host the world's largest international education conference. We've been virtual this year. We're looking forward to being in person next year. And one of the things we'll be hearing is from our colleagues around the world about what does the world look like now. So that will be in Denver in 2022. And in 2023, we're back home. We'll be back in Washington, and we look forward to welcoming everyone back to the nation's capital. So again, it's an honor to work on international education. It's been exciting to see the intersection of international education and international leadership, to see the expansion of international education in many different parts of the world, and the greater interest in welcoming international students to be part of our communities. So I will stop there, and I would love to open the floor to questions, comments, or anything else you might have on your minds. Thank you.
We have a microphone for anybody that would like to ask a question.
This one there.
Oh, excuse me.
Hey, thanks for coming. Todd McGarvey, I work here at the school. And I was just wondering how we should think about the values of diversity and inclusion around international students with the significant financial costs that particularly mobility-based education requires, and that absent external funding, there's very little budget incentive for these costs to be reduced by institutions.
That is an excellent question. And indeed, one of the profound questions is, how do we make sure that for students, once they set foot on a campus, are able to benefit from all the services, and one of them is international education. And indeed, one of the things that we've looked at is both how do you not only look at addressing financial issues, the immediate cost, and how you try to support that and raise support for that. But also there are often other challenges. As you know, the majority of students in higher education work. And so how do you offset the fact that you will not be earning income, and looking for creative ways to do that? The reason I asked my colleague to talk about that is that some of the things that we particularly thought about is to try to do that. So that one of the books that I'll be sharing and leaving you copies of is Promoting Inclusion and Education Abroad. NAFSA actually, we see our role is to try to get answers. So what we did is we commissioned a set of scholars to write on those very issues. And they tried to think of inclusion in very different ways. So they talk about racial inclusion, but also, let's say, traveling with disabilities. There's a whole range of different ways to say, whatever our wonderful stripe of humanity, how can we help you? And to then draw on real world examples. And so what they did is then looking at examples from campuses of trying to expand inclusion in education abroad. One of the challenges of the pandemic will be how we'll have to do some work to recover some of those mechanisms. But indeed, there are examples of campuses coming up with some practical ways to do that. Yes, please. Yes.
Thanks. Thank you so much. I enjoyed this a lot. I am curious what you or NAFSA would say to critics who talk about international education as being a contributor to the phenomenon of brain drain, and sort of what the responsibility is, what type of work is done to combat that, or just sort of how would you respond to that in this work?
Right. Thank you for the question. And it's always important to ask, what are the unintended consequences? And I would say that one of the things we're seeing is that you're seeing more brain circulation. So 2-3 generations ago, you might have seen more of the leave a country, go to another, probably wealthier country, get your education, stay, and lose contact. What we're seeing more of, not ever, but an increased aspect of being able, let's say, to go home, participate in business education, and then go back and forth. And so that people are retaining contact with their communities. This, of course, is helped by one, air transport, but then also, internet businesses, other things that allow you to remain connected with your home community in a way that may not have been possible a generation ago. And so that's what's really exciting to see, is that people who are actually, let's say, starting businesses, working, staying in contact with their family in multiple places. So always an important thing to ask, but that trend in remaining contact, I think, is an important one for the international education community to follow.
So I have lots of questions for you, but the one I'm going to start with is basically about the U.S. relationship with China in this space. And for a long time when I was here, the largest number of international students we had at the school by far were from China. And that's really changed in the last few years. And I would say that that's partly because the United States has become more concerned about this, security-related or economic-related negative effects of educating people from China who will go back to China, right? The downside. And the Chinese government, I think, is equally concerned that knowledge is dangerous. You're talking about basically the benefits of democracy, promotion, and human rights, and they're not so sure they want that. So how have you seen your organization's relationship with China and sort of the attitudes of the Chinese to international education change over time?
Thank you. We could have had a whole lecture just on that time, but thank you for the question. And there are many complex aspects, so I'd like to touch on several different things. First is to look at, and just to go back where I started, was the huge increase in the number of Chinese students here, and the relatively small number of U.S. students going to China. But that is one of the major phenomena, of course, and as you probably already know, the largest number of international students are from China in the United States, and now in all of the other major host countries I listed. That's been a big change. The last one was the UK, where the US was the largest, but now the number of Chinese students is large. So the world historical phenomenon of China entering back into the global system after 500 years of absence, that is, again, one of the great changes of our lifetimes. And the fact that occurred also through the education space. So to some degree, you would have seen a period there, in fact, a generation where you saw Chinese students going abroad. And questions, how might have changed? That kind of already would have been some change, because Chinese universities are also expanding, improving, being able to provide more of the elements of what people study at home. So that phenomenon, that's just sort of the academic phenomenon was. Then you add the overlay of the world historical strategic questions. Mm-hmm. And particularly, because not only are we started off talking about the nature of leadership, and I talked about political and military, we could have spent a lot of time on particularly the knowledge aspect of national security issues. So that the fact that Huawei is an issue is because the intersection of the knowledge economy, the cyberspace, and national security, which heightens what was already going to be a competition. Let's say competition in the South China Sea, classic competition for freedom of navigation. We want to see that anyway. But now this whole other level of competition in cyberspace makes this even more interesting and more acute. And it comes directly at that point. And the role of particularly of research in particular. It is striking to see the change in the attitude towards working with scholars. And scholars, of course, by nature have multiple connections, whether in their own biographies, in their research teams, and again, the institutions, and you can tell me more about the University of Maryland experience, but one of the challenges is also, what are the rules of the institution at which a scholar is actually based? And how, and to what extent are they reporting the relationships, and what extent can we already use the existing understanding of how you report your relationships with multiple institutions to be able to meet the absolutely legitimate national security concerns about what research is being done where, especially with federal dollars, and respect for civil liberties and avoiding profiling that we've also seen go on. And so I think we're trying to have more clearer standards about how individuals are handled is important. But I've seen it change very quickly. So I'll say I had the honor to serve on the National Security Education Board as part of the Department of Defense, oversees the board fellowships. With the last appointments from the Obama administration, then you serve for 4 years. So that I was sworn in like January to 2015, and then actually through 2019. That said, one of the things was to see in the National Defense Authorization Act the issue about Confucius Institutes, and so one of the biggest changes has been the change in view towards Confucius Institutes. When I started at NAFSA, there were about 110 at institutions around the United States. There are probably less than 60 at this point. So that's been dramatic, as you said, the reaction. And then one of the things, I mean, again, interested in your experience here, but obviously, University of Maryland's a major institution, you have other alternatives, but I've talked to colleagues where that was their Chinese language program. And now they realize they will end that. And so one of my concerns, I would say, is that it's important that we understand each other. That, I mean, I got my DPhil in 1989. Okay, so right at the end, the point where you had the end of the Cold War. So I can remember it was important that my friends who were studying the Soviet Union learned Russian and knew about their institutions. I think it's important that Americans learn about China and Chinese students learn about the United States. So we've got to keep those channels open while dealing with the important national security issues.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentation. As an international graduate student, so my question is coming from like the cost-effective point of view. So I am curious to know how cost-effective it would be if we have more international graduate students on campuses, because we know that just like some of like the graduate students, international graduate students pay their tuition. A good portion of them get paid like from their schools or departments. So I'm curious to know that.
Oh, thank you for the question. What are you studying?
I'm at the School of Public Policy, MPP student, Master of Public Policy.
All right, great,
Yeah.
great. So indeed, there are so many levels to the question. So one aspect is that again for institutions is to have a rich mix of people in a classroom, just so that you have a wide range of ideas. And I always put that first. But I do note that for many institutions also that, as you know, that international students usually pay the full fee, the full fee, and therefore have been an important source of revenue for institutions. Also, if we look at the number of students, and you look at the birth rate and the number of students of college age, that one of the challenges is that what will be the drop-off in college students in the 2020s. And so many institutions will need to think about first, hopefully, bringing in more students in the United States and bringing in more international students to make sure that they fill their classrooms. And indeed, that is one of the points we often make to our members of Congress, is to remind them that when at times people will make an argument saying, is international students taking a seat for an American? I'll say, actually, that international student may be enabling that American to be in that seat because they paid the full tuition, which is helping the institution make sure that everybody benefits. So there's both, of course, an intellectual benefit, but also a financial benefit as well for many institutions. But I will also note that the master's degree program is one of the most competitive worldwide. And so that, again, institutions around the world are also recognizing that the competition for bright, talented students at the master's level is fierce, because people realize, you may have done your first degree at home, you're looking for an additional professional opportunity, and many institutions in many parts of the world have targeted that particular level of master's students. The other, so for example, when I was listed, kind of list up of different countries, I happened to list most of them were English-speaking countries, but not all. But one of the interesting phenomena is that it's possible to take a degree in English, not in an English-speaking country. So there's now competition. You can go to Germany and Sweden and take a degree in English. So there's now competition in ways that might not have been a generation ago. So it's both important, again, for the quality and excitement in the classroom, but there are also these economic issues are also present in the experience of international students at the graduate level. Yes.
Thank you so much, Esther. This was fantastic. I want to ask you to put your policymaker hat back on for a second. And I think you just gave a wonderful talk about the importance and the values of, in old speak, soft power, the value of attraction. We're coming 2 days up to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, and let's just say the last 20 years have been the heyday of the resurgence of hard power in many ways. Where do you think we are on the spectrum of trying to rebalance our hard and soft power strategy in the United States? And where do you think we could be if we play our cards right on that hard soft power balance, given the activities and the tragedy of Afghanistan in recent days? Politically, it may be hard to get the rebalance that we want.
Wow, thank you for that complex question. I would say that actually that we have some important changes and some important continuities. That in terms of important changes, indeed, one of the, again, we look at the scope of the balance between hard and soft power, or smart power, that indeed we did experience when we first met, that we look at the period right after the end of the Cold War and the opening up and the rethinking of the nature of great power rivalry. And so that we saw that there was a pause in classic great power military rivalry after the end of the Cold War. And the question about what was international order going to look like, what was going to be the nature of governance, whether it was in Eastern Europe and eventually becoming part of the European Union, and changes in South Africa, again, that the opening up and the situation was no longer burdened by the Cold War, and there was greater receptivity to actually ending apartheid. All of this created real dynamics about what was the nature of international order going to look like. And then the question of what people thought, how people thought were important issues. And the dynamics of people now find in many parts of the world opportunities for greater involvement in governance. And so the relevance of soft power and soft power was clearer. And indeed, I could argue now that yes, we are seeing a return to classic great power rivalry between the United States and China. And that you see it, and that some of the things that I mentioned the South China Sea specifically precise because we're seeing some things that, as someone who always like classical theories of international relations, I did my master's on Vattel, who's all about neutrality and the laws, particularly the law of the sea, what becomes the law of the sea, and the nature of the rights of states and their coasts. All of this is extremely relevant again. However, as I said, this is a knowledge-driven economy. We may be circling each other's frigates in the South China Sea. We may be crashing into each other's satellites in space, but we care about what people think. And still the most powerful agent of change is education of what people think. And everybody recognizes that. That's one reason China is expanding its universities, U.S. expanding its universities, others recognize that space, as I said, the intangible space of the mind is still the first place of confrontation, but also a genuine debate about the nature of human society. One of the questions, as you know, is even about looking at the COVID-19 crisis has been, do the authoritarian states or the democratic states, how are they dealing with this? So even at almost every level of competition comes back to these very fundamental philosophical questions. So although we see a return to classic great power rivalry, that what people think, the values they hold are still the forefront of the nature of competition, and therefore understanding them is still relevant.
Hi, my name is Ariel Petrovich. I'm a faculty member here, and I really enjoyed this presentation. It actually spoke right into some of the stuff we were going over in class today. So it's really nice example of basically other ways in which that states can interact, especially when the issue can be over security. It might not be directly related to security that you might actually interact on these spheres. But related to this question about how you were mentioning a lot of the other countries that you had listed up there, including Germany, for example, but I know China has this as well, have programs where degree seekers can get their degree in English. The US obviously doesn't have quite as much of that in other languages, but we have so many foreign students coming in. So what is it that basically NAFSA's approach and some of the other countries' approaches could be to for educators who want to be able to engage with international students and the qualities they can bring in without devaluing basically the writing and basically credibility of the degrees that they're actually giving out in the end, since it is only English speaking programs by and large. So basically, what are some of the ways we can encourage this without sort of devaluing some of what we still hold to be important? And thank you.
Indeed, very basic question. So one of the things I would say that is particularly look to some of the things that NAFSA members are doing at their institutions, around the country. And one of them is also looking at how do you help students be able to actually participate in the classroom once they're there. So there's a whole discussion of the nature of English language programs. And indeed, as you know, one of the dramatic declines has been in the number of students who have been involved in English language programs that are designed to help them learn enough English to be able to be functional in the classroom. There are lots of reasons for that, but one of the things we've just been looking at with some is how can you make sure that you recover some of those programs so students are actually able to participate, because it doesn't help the student and doesn't help the institution if people get here and feel that they were not prepared. So we're looking at and encouraging some of the articles in the International Educator magazine. We're talking a bit about how do you kind of recover that while maintaining quality, maintaining quality in particular, so that citizens can participate. The other aspect is looking at how in classrooms also how you support that. So if we actually look at some of NAFSA's life cycle of education programs, that also looks at how people both in classrooms and administrators can help support support international students. So we both in our work on the what we call the management development program, which is now all electronic course, which looks at how do people actually, what do they draw on, what resources do they draw on, and so that's a lot of our training is helping people look at that specifically. But it's all, I've got to give credit to the members because it's all based on actually what people are doing. And so we're trying to share best practices. When we don't invent it in our office, we just help facilitate the best practices that we're seeing around campuses and getting that out to people.
I was just sitting here thinking about online education, and one of the conversations we're having amongst our faculty is, basically our study abroad programs have been one of the things we've been particularly proud of, and obviously something we've not been able to do during the pandemic. So trying to figure out, are there ways to take advantage of what we've learned about online education to give students more of an international experience while they're physically here, without reducing incentives for people to actually go abroad too? So do you see online education really as, a sort of force multiplier, or as a real threat to your model?
Great question. And so yes, I think actually the first few months there was this, after we got past the first wave of we need to get these students back or get people home, was and through the transition was a recognition that actually it can be, quote, a force multiplier. That now that we see that on several examples of people being able to say, we worked with our normal in-person partner in country X, we were then able to put together some of the curriculum and adjust it and be able to cover certain concepts now so that we can then prepare people for going the next semester or the next year. And so there are interesting examples of how people basically reinforce their existing partnerships by preparing earlier. And some will keep that even when they go back into in-person. So I actually have a list of those I did bring with me, but we'd be happy to, afterwards I can put you in touch with people who actually go through with you some of the specific examples of where people have done that. Because that's, I say, it's now been long enough that we can now see some of the results and what people did last year, and then how they were able to build that. And interesting, then to link to the earlier question about brain drain, was actually to see that in some cases we saw a U.S. institution in a developing country, which where there might have been a previous imbalance, and one of the kind of debates and discussions, kind of the scholarly work of people working on this, is the to decolonize international education as well, and to make sure, because there's often the challenge of the imbalance between wealthy Western university and maybe its local partner, that working in the virtual space, once you've dealt with the actual technical difficulties, has in some cases allowed more of an equal engagement, because you have faculty from both sides, you have students from both sides, there's been an input, and it's actually allowed sometimes the smaller partner to actually have more say in the program, and then that will be maintained in the future. So there've been some very interesting dynamics coming out of that, but I'd be happy to follow up with you about that as well.
Well, it looks like we've come up to the end of our time. I know that the hordes of students are going to start rolling through here soon, going to class. But thank you very much for speaking to us today.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much.